And we're going to be started in no time. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Brian Garvey. I'm the executive director here at Massachusetts Peace Action. If this is your first time hearing about us, Massachusetts Peace Action is the largest grassroots peace organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we are truly a grassroots organization. We are driven by the power of activists and volunteers to spread community education about peace and anti-war issues, but also to inspire advocacy among our members and many activists to convince people that these issues that are national and international in scope do truly touch their daily lives, but even more importantly, that they should join in and raise their voices, and that that can make a difference towards a more peaceful US foreign policy and a better world in general. So that's a snapshot about Massachusetts Peace Action. We work on many issues, including nuclear disarmament, which was our founding issue, racial justice and indigenous solidarity, which are peace issues, against climate change, which is a peace issue, for peace in the Middle East, of course, to a peaceful resolution of the destruction in Gaza, to prevent any further war with Iran, to have negotiated settlement, end the far too long and far too destructive war in Ukraine. But of course, what we're talking about tonight is a more peaceful policy toward our neighbors in Latin America, including Mexico, which, if you even pay a slight bit of attention to the current administration and past administrations as well, you know that our neighbor to the south and one of our largest trading partners has been a perpetual punching bag for this administration. And that is something that we absolutely want to put a stop to, because not only to be a good neighbor, that's important enough, but because the government and the people of Mexico are doing some amazing things, and we can learn some lessons from our neighbors to the south. Now, I'm not going to give it all away because we have many fantastic speakers and a fantastic moderator who's going to jump right in, and I will introduce her. Ellen Mass is a longtime member of our Latin America and Caribbean Working Group. Now, like I said, all those issues we work on are powered by volunteers, volunteer working groups, and campaigns, and we invite you to join us. And in a follow-up, I will be sending information on just how to do so. Ellen has been talking about Mexico and the fantastic developments and transformation that's been going on in Mexico of late for a very long time. She has written a many-part series. I think it ended up being a 6-part series on the transformations in Mexico that go all the way back to Mexican independence from Spain to the current day, and the history that led to this moment where Mexico is making some fantastic developments. And these are the ones that we want to learn about so we can learn from them. But without further ado, I'm going to bring up our moderator for the program, Ellen Mass.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm so pleased to see so many people who want to learn more about our neighbor to the south. I mean, most importantly, in regards Mexico, is to note its excuse me, is to note its geographical location within North America. Even the underground geographical tectonic plates connect us. Mexico's public standing among the most powerful alliances in the world give us a hint of its impact. I'm speaking of the Community of Latin America, Caribbean States, CELAC, the G7 that just met in Canada, the G20 that met in Brazil, ALMA, the progressive Latin American regional countries, and Brics to be. And also those in Asia. I've just mentioned a few, but Mexico has made an enormous impact through its economic, political, and social successes. And it's created this elevated global stature with respect to popular presidential leaders such as Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, and Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, a scientist with Jewish background with an 80% approval rating in a mostly Catholic and indigenous country. So tonight, to wrap our heads around this, we have two speakers who know the country well. And we'll have short question and answer after each speaker, and then again at the end. Now, before I introduce the first speaker, we're going to have a video so those of you can share in the impressive nature of the present president, Claudia. And then I will introduce Regina Hostess and afterwards. Are we ready for the video?
Sure, just give me 1 second to
I
bring it up
wanted
on
to
the screen.
say just
Oh,
that
please go ahead, Emma. Yeah.
Yeah, just that this video is taken in Campeche, where I went to stay and interview people from the Bienestar program. And this is the video of Claudia coming to deliver the benefits to that state, which is the sparsest state and the largest in Mexico. And so she's starting with the indigenous benefits in this video, and it's a very impressive. You'll have the subtitles.
Citizen Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, Constitutional President of the United Mexican States and Supreme Commander in the Armed Forces. Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. Distinguished leaders of the G7, friends of the international community. I come before you as the President of Mexico, as the representative of a dignified and proud people who love their history and culture and who have been known for promoting peace. This is written in our political constitution. Mexico has historically been a country that promotes dialogue, disarmament, and respect for the sovereignty of peoples. A great president of Mexico, Benito Juarez Garcia, a Zapotec indigenous man of great vision, known as the Benemerito de las Americas, left the following thought as a universal legacy: between individuals and nations, respect for the rights of others is peace. With this as a principle, and given the international situation from which we cannot ignore, in the name of Mexico we call on the great nations to build instead of destroy, to work firmly for peace. Perhaps we are idealists, but we prefer the call for humanism to surrendering to conformism or silence. Talking about security and energy transition is also talking about peace. We are all deeply concerned about the resurgence of armed conflicts and the normalization of violence, discrimination, and suffering in the world. No interest can be above human lives. Hatred between nations, communities, and individuals must not dominate today's civilization. From our perspective, the path is not the arms race, but active diplomacy. Politics was invented to avoid war in any of its manifestations, whether military or commercial, or cold. Politics was invented to avoid desolation, to build accounts and solutions. It was invented so that peace could be built, not imposed. Peace does not consist solely of the absence of war. It also implies the presence of justice, fair trade, opportunities, cooperation for development, and respect for human rights. In this context, it is essential to recognize the individuals and families who have migrated out of necessity.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I know, that's why I brought you. Thank you very much. And who contribute significantly to the countries that receive them. In particular, it is necessary to highlight the Mexicans who have resided in the United States for years. We are referring to hardworking, honest people who have built their lives with dignity, comply with the laws, are dedicated and diligent, pay taxes, assume responsibilities, and do not deserve discrimination, but rather respect and recognition. The ultimate goal is for people to have well-paid employment and access to a dignified life in their places of origin, to have well-being. At the last meeting of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, I proposed holding a summit for the economic well-being. I propose a similar meeting in which, in addition to CELAC, the member countries of the G7, the countries invited today, and others who wish to participate will participate. The purpose is to strengthen effective cooperation for development, fair and reciprocal trade as the basis for a lasting peace that the entire world yearns for. All citizens of all countries should have the opportunity to live a life of well-being, and although it may seem like a dream, it is possible. This would mean moving towards a more equitable, peaceful, and sustainable international community. Economic well-being and cooperation for development are acts of shared responsibility for all nations. In a world marked by interdependencies, no country can isolate itself or prosper at the expense of others. Committing to cooperation is ultimately committing to a common future based on justice. May this G7 not be just a meeting of powers, but a space for shared responsibility, because power is not measured only by what one has, but by what one does with it. Thank you very much. A very good call.
Thank you, Brian. You didn't get to see Campeche, but you did get to see Claudia in Canada, which is very impressive as well. That was the G7 in, I don't know how you pronounce the city, the town in Canada, but a beautiful, beautiful spot. And she was the darling of that seventh after Donald J. Trump had taken off. She was the center of attention with the others who really, really want to invest in Mexico. Their purpose is often not quite her purpose socially, but economically, they were really courting Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo. So now I'm going to introduce Regina Hugues from Mexico City, who's been experiencing the changes firsthand as she lives there with differing opinions from friends, family, and colleagues. She studied social responsibility and sustainable development at Anahuac University in Mexico City, and she's worked for over 7 years as a Spanish teacher with adults of all ages and professions. She volunteered in Oaxaca and worked in the Mexican government offices and also in the private sector. She's also my Spanish teacher, which is no small task to tackle. So without further ado, Regina, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your experience with Mexico and some of the changes you've noted?
Hi, Elena. Thank you so much for that introduction. Well, I mean, there's just so much that I could say, on this topic, both the new things that we're seeing and like all the hope and optimism that this brings for us, while at the same time experiencing the local controversy that these new governments have also caused within certain communities. And so I guess maybe if I start with myself, um, I could say, um, well, growing up, something that I remember was just like as a kid, looking around and noticing certain things, and a certain heartbreaking images, just being exposed to a lot of poverty, a lot of people on the streets, kids, a lot of kids asking for money Here, it's very common for us to have people asking for money at the red lights with children, with babies, people with diseases. But not just that, we really do experiment the poverty and the inequality in many different ways. And I remember being a kid, and I mean, I'm sorry if this is a bit too direct, but I remember asking my mom at some point, like, Mom, why is everyone that cleans and packs the bags at the groceries? Because that's a job in Mexico. It's a job, and you pay literally cents to the people who do that. But I remember asking at some point, like noticing this pattern and asking my mom, like, why do we look so different? Like, why is it that when there's people that work in like minimum wage kind of jobs, why is it that they always seem to be from indigenous descent, or they seem like we seem to be divided by races? And I remember that I was very shocked when my mom responded, "Oh, really? I hadn't really noticed." And I guess that as a kid, you just start realizing certain things, um, realizing also the silent things, the things that we don't talk about. And I guess as a language teacher, I'm very sensitive to language, both the things that we say and also the things that we don't say. So it just started like this very philosophical questioning for me, and really trying to understand what was going on with my society and what was going on with this inequality, and why I saw myself as such a privileged person, and I had access to all these very first world services, while noticing that most of people didn't. And I was privileged enough to study for a year in Canada, in Toronto, when I was 15. And it was the first time that I really noticed nature. I got to see the seasons for the first time in my life, because we don't really have seasons here like you guys do. We don't have a fall, we don't really have winter, and then the spring where you get to see everything just come back to life. And I remember that I was just struck by the spectacle of nature, and just realizing that nature was alive. It was a living entity, and we were inside of it. And that also, sorry, by that age, I was starting to get a bit older. I came back to Mexico, and I remember saying, like, I feel like I put on glasses that I didn't know that I needed. And so for the first time, I just really started seeing the inequality, the disrespect to the environment, how normal corruption was for us. Things like in Canada at school, the popular girls were had the best grades. It was like cool to care. And then in my school in Mexico, it was the opposite. Like it was super uncool to care. And so I just had this very intense contrast that led me to search for answers. And I just started watching documentaries like crazy, and trying to understand how capitalism worked, and what was going on with societies, and how multinationals operated, and what was going on with the environment. And eventually, I studied social responsibility and sustainable development, which was a very new career, or well, that's how we call it in Mexico, but like a very new major by that time. But because of my values, my interests, I really didn't relate to anything else as much as I related to that. And so I went into it, although people around me were like, "What? What are you even going to do with your life after studying that?" But I just dived in, and it was pretty harsh. It was pretty harsh because what we really tried to learn was, where is the problem? Where is the problem truly coming from? And going deep into how society works, both locally and internationally, how slavery, corruption, destruction of the environment, displacements of communities are are institutionalized, and how the problem that we're dealing with as a society, both locally and internationally, is very embedded in our mindset, in our institutions, and yeah, and our lifestyles. Because here in Mexico, although it's something that it's very unspoken of, but it is a very racist society. And we say that more than racist is a classist society, because race will indicate your economical class, and it really sadly does dictate the opportunities that you're going to have access to, both from the place where you were born in, and so the services that you had around you and the education you had access to, and then the further steps that you could take on, but both just by the color that you have, the name that you have, and how that can stop you from accessing certain jobs, certain educational opportunities, certain social circles. And it was pretty harsh, to be honest, those years, to really understand how deep the problem was and how corruption didn't just happen. It wasn't like a recent thing that a few people just like found a way to be corrupt, but more so to understand that a lot of our institutions, a a lot of the dynamics, the internal schemes were based on corruption. And after that, I decided to work in the government for a bit just because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. This was about 10 years ago. I got to be in the Secretary of the Environment, and another devastating experience, to be very honest. It was just exhausting to keep hearing the decision makers constantly finding excuses, constantly saying that there was not enough money to actually comply with the obligations that we had towards the environment, or certain situations where there were, for example, protests outside the secretary because they had approved certain factories in a region that would burn trash, and they would emit a very high amount of toxins in the air. And that community had already had issues with that, both with respiratory issues, but also a factory that had previously exploded. And so you had a group of teachers, lawyers, doctors, people who had to leave their job in order to go demand that the government gives them the protection that they're supposed to. Because even on paper, it was very clear that this factory did not meet the criteria to operate safely in that area. And I just remember seeing the reaction of my boss, because I got to be in the meeting. And I just really remember the arrogance and how easily he let go of the problem, how he did not engage at all. He even adopted like this position as he was listening to these concerned family members and these people. And I just remember feeling in my gut and in my heart, like, what is this? What kind of politics is this? And, several examples like that, several situations where all I could see were decision makers being absolutely detached from the people that they were serving. And I think that was like a general feeling in politics. And eventually I ended up working at a marketing agency. Didn't like it too. It just didn't fit my values, although I was in the sustainability area. And languages have always been a passion of mine. It's something that I've always loved. And I naturally, before I knew it, started teaching, and it took off. And then the pandemic came, and that's how I got very involved teaching, especially people in the US, adults and all kinds of people. But moving on more to like the changes that I've been seeing now. The changes that I really experienced. Oh, I forgot to mention my experience in it was Chiapas, Ellen. It's a state next to Oaxaca. A, I think it's the second poorest state in the country. And also just I was very privileged because my cousin was the director of an NGO. So I was just very interesting to participate. And she told me, like, well, you know what? You can just tag along. We have a crew going around the state, visiting different communities that find themselves in very, very extreme situations of poverty. And what the NGO did was something that they established a system that we call saving boxes. And so that means that they gather the community, the women, they get the women in the community and they help them establish a savings mechanism, so that that way, little by little, they can start saving all together. Because these people, this was 10 years ago, but I knew that one of the families together, a family of 5 people, all of them together in 1 month were able to save about 10 cents of a dollar working the entire month. 10 cents of a dollar. And so the idea was for them to come together, save money together, and then start a mechanism to loan the money to each other to solve medical needs, commercial needs, any kind of economical need that any given individual or family would have. And then that way they would eventually start like scaling up the amount of resources they could access. And it was one of the most life-changing experiences ever, because I got to be the minority. I got to be in a place where I was the only person of my color. I was the only one speaking Spanish. A lot of them didn't even speak Spanish. So I couldn't even communicate with my words. I could only communicate with my eyes, with my demeanor, through gestures, through my body language. And especially with the kids. I realized in the communities that the best way to connect and to get people to trust you was through the kids. So it was just this very beautiful experience of going into the jungle for like a few hours drive, arriving at a community that was built with huts and, very, very few resources, no light, maybe some drainage, but not really, which actually I got upset when I saw drainage in the middle of the jungle. I was like, what? Where are, like, I don't know if you call them in English dry toilets, or like the toilets without water that you can compost and then turn into fertilizer. But anyways, I heard very crazy stories about the violence that people experience there. And it's a very, very high level of violence that we don't see in the newspapers. This is the kind of information that we don't get in the news. What women go through, what kids go through, even men. Back then, for example, the government, which was PRI, the Revolutionary Party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the way that they would get votes from people is that they would go into the communities and give them TVs and guns. And that's how they earned people's votes. And I heard about more than one person who was really trying to set up maybe an agricultural like system at home so that they could start making money off of that, or fish. I remember this guy who wanted to have like a fish tank, but they were not part of the PRI party, so they wouldn't give them the money. They would have to affiliate to the party in order to get the money. And they're very like proud people. So I remember them saying like, no, I'm not gonna do it. I'm gonna fight for my right to get my subsidies so that I can work the land the way that it is, without having to support a party that I don't support. And it was just a very, very just like shaking experience to be at the house of some of the poorest people in the country, and noticing the way that they looked at me and the way that I was dressed and the things that I had just on myself, and have them feed me, have them kill their turkeys to make me soup. And I remember at the time I was a vegetarian and I was like, vegetarianism does not exist here. You know, if these people, whatever they offer you, you have it right there and you ask for seconds. And that's an experience that most people in Mexico haven't had. I think it's rare for someone to have had an experience like that. And I remember being when I was working at the government and thinking like, wow, it's just shocking to me how little the ones making decisions know the reality of millions in this country, of the isolation, the poverty, the malnourishment, the violence, the exhaustion, the disease, the lack of opportunities, the lack of access to anything. Some
But
children,
Regina, would you bring this up to the president, how you see
of
it
course,
happening a little bit?
of course, of course. Well, as you saw in the video, we saw Claudia wearing, I don't know if any of you noticed that that's a typical indigenous dress. I couldn't recognize where it was from. But to me, just that speaks volumes. I think that for the first time, we have a government since AMLO that really does know what it is like for people in this country. And I think that's the most refreshing, mm, yeah, that's just the most refreshing perspective that this country can get now. Because really, we have all the resources that we need. We have human capital to spare. We have we have everything. But finally, we have a government that's interested in getting all that everything to everyone and understanding that that is a better strategy than hoarding everything for just a small group and then leaving the rest to just keep working the way they do, keep struggling the way they do, and let them get used to it. Some of the big difference that I see, big differences, well, I mean, things like and this is since AMLO, because Claudia fortunately is continuing with his agenda and she's doing it in the most fabulous and sophisticated way, if you ask me. But things from defending corn, which was one of the indigenous battles, a very silent battle, nowhere in the news, yet affecting the livelihood and also the quality of one of the most important plants and species of plants that we have, because corn is very diverse. So fighting against a GMO corn, representing the interests of the indigenous and the farmers, the Mayan train, which here has caused huge controversy. And it's very funny because people who I've never heard care about the environment, they see on the newspapers something negative about the environment related to the Mayan train. Because before I continue, I just want to make a small parenthesis and just let you know that here in Mexico, there's a big class divide. Higher classes do not like the the current president or AMLO, because um, this philosophy, according to them, really threatens their capacity to keep producing their wealth the way they do. And I think that businessmen and the high class have felt very threatened about this new um, perspective and new legal system, because a lot of that richness has been produced through exploitation and through the fact that we don't have to pay extra hours. You don't have to pay bonuses to people. You can the minimum wage here in Mexico is just a joke, to be honest. And so for the higher classes and for big companies such as Coca-Cola, which the CEO during the pandemic He literally said, when the president made him pay taxes because Coca-Cola hadn't paid taxes in Mexico, because the businessmen and politicians tend to be friends, which is a wonderful combination for them. But once they forced them to pay taxes for the first time, the CEO got so upset that he had to pay his taxes in Mexico that he said that he would invest twice as much to bring the president down. So there's been a lot of black campaigns against AMLO, against Claudia, but and the high classes, a lot of people unfortunately fall for it, and they fall for this idea that this government is populist or a socialist, and that we're gonna end up like other countries that blah blah blah, and like we're gonna get into a fight with everyone, and um so yeah, that eh, wait, where was I going before my parentheses? Well, yeah, it's very controversial there, but because of the power that the high class has on the media and the information that's spread through the media to the consumers of those specific media outlets. But other than that, I mean, people here are the happiest. Going back to the Mayan train, which was very controversial because people were talking about a lot of destruction of the environment and how terrible that's going to be for the jungle. But unfortunately, people don't know that the jungle is already being destroyed by different kinds of communities. Um, Out of need, because the way the law works is that if you have animals, then to like for a job, like they'll pay you, they'll give you a subsidy. So people will go, they will cut a small amount, they will grow there, or they will have animals, but then either because they nowadays we don't use regenerative uh, processes to grow food. It's all mono cultives and using a lot of chemicals, a lot of pesticides. So it's very common, and this is something that I saw in Chiapas, that once a piece of land is done with its yield, they will go and cut the another part, and then another part, and then another part, and then another part. So actually, we've been having a huge problem of what we call ant deforestation, which means that people do the deforestation little by little in order to get access to money from the government so that they can grow something, so that they can have a job. And so what people here in the city don't understand, here where we have access to absolutely everything, is that people who are isolated, and this is a known psychological fact, you need to have stability, financial stability, in order to do your share for the environment. So I think it's actually a very intelligent process to put the train so that you can trigger, yes, tourism, but mostly access from people who are very isolated, both to take the train and go places, as well as have people come to them. And that way you turn the place, the land in itself, into the value. You make nature valuable because that's what people are coming in to see. So you're activating people, you're giving people a reason to make money while taking care of their surroundings and giving them access to move around, giving them access to society, giving them access to more education, and mainly to a sustainable source of livelihood. And I think that if that project is done well, it's exactly what this country needs to bring in all the communities that we have isolated and to decentralize everything that we have here in the capital, because here we have everything. Decentralize it so the benefits and the opportunities that we have here can expand to reach the rest of the country, and not just keep accumulating and accumulating and accumulating all the resources in this one area.
And
I don't know
can
if,
you
yeah.
can you give us about 4 minutes of questions because I'm sure people will ask you contemporary questions related to what you're talking about, like the pension and the Bienestar program. You said people in your family. Maybe I'll start it off for about 4 minutes of questions because we're going to do it at the end after Lenny speaks.
Okay.
Let's uh, people may want to ask questions. I think you should end on the Bienestar program and people you've known who have benefited from these new social welfare programs.
Hmm. Should I wait for questions or should I talk
So,
about the Bienestar program?
yeah, go ahead and talk about it. Yeah. Yes,
Well, some of
talk
the
about it.
benefits that I do see, the people from my family, women in my family are already receiving the aid. And I've heard about people in other cities and in other towns who are also receiving it. And I just want you to know, in Mexico, that's huge. In Mexico, that's huge because we would have a lot of programs in the past where there were a lot of promises made, and then no one really ever saw anything. And for the first time, we're seeing things happen quickly. I had my gardener, I used to live in Puebla, and I heard from my gardener's dad that he was also receiving some money from another program, another agricultural program based on regenerating the land. So they would come in, teach them how to grow crops in a regenerative way, and if you do it, they'll pay you. And he was part of the program and he was just the happiest. Um, just yesterday, I saw someone from the Bienestar program walking around the streets, knocking on doors. So I think what's most amazing is that it's not just a promise, it is actually happening. And the money is reaching all the different kinds of people that really do need it in order to get to a certain point where they can keep growing. Because for a lot of people, money is such an urgency that they live in a very short term kind of situation with very minimum wage kind of jobs, having to deal with health issues, family issues, and the fact that this money is arriving to all these different groups and activating these different kinds of activities depending on the group, I think is just fantastic. And it really is the first for Mexico. Mhm.
I'm looking for hands raised or anyone else who wants to ask her a question, just short at this point, but please feel free. Anybody want to ask?
I'll jump in and ask a question if that's all right.
Well,
You talked a little bit about the pandemic. One thing that I have heard is that Mexico may be the only government to maintain the same party in control after the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about why you think they managed to do that?
Well, honestly, I was very surprised to see how well Mexico dealt with the pandemic. Again, here, like on the inside, there was a lot of like black campaigns around it. But I think that on the one hand, it was very smart of the government to get all the funding that they needed from all the multinationals that had not been paying taxes for years. So for the first time, Coca-Cola had to pay for taxes, 7-Eleven, Volkswagen, many other big multinationals that had been able to operate for years, Walmart, without paying their taxes. And so the government, what they did was like, we're not going to charge the people for this. I'm sorry, multinationals, but it's your time to pay what you owe this country. People got very upset, but I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And then the Secretary of Health, yeah, I think he was also very efficient. He was constantly putting out information, constantly having conferences, constantly trying to send the money to the hospitals to make sure that they could receive all the people. I think we also were quite flexible in terms of the quarantine. And I think people were very like happy about that because some could stay home and work from home, but some other people just had to go out. And I think that that flexibility that we were given, while at the same time having a lot of access to the mouth covers, gloves, gel, and things like that, to me, that would be part of the key and why Mexico was able to stay afloat so well during the pandemic.
Thank you. I also saw in the chat that R. Hunley had a question, but I think you're having trouble getting to the raise hand, but we'll try and facilitate you. But I see that Pat has a question.
Mr.
So
Gallardo also is attempting to raise his hand.
thank you. Thank you. But let me bring up Pat and then I will bring up those folks right after.
Hi, thank you. It's really interesting to hear what's going on. My question has to do with obviously there's a challenge to the long time control of the government and the economy. And although, there's bringing a lot of aid to people obviously who need it and should have it. What kind of organizing is going on? What kind of reaction of the reactionary forces is mobilizing? I have some family connections, and a lot of them come from what you described as your social milieu, and they're not particularly happy. I mean, small business people, well-educated people, and so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's going on for people who are don't feel that they're being hated.
Yeah, well, I thank you so much for your question, Pat. I think that's a very interesting topic because I think about it a lot too. And I think I mean it's probably a multi-answer kind of, answer, but I think it has to do with a lot of things. One of them, the fear. There's a lot of fear that giving other people a chance will mean that the opportunities will get taken away from us. So I think that deep down, it has a lot to do with that, with like this idea that, and I hear people saying a lot, like people are poor because they want to. People who work make a living. Um, but I think it's very hard to accept that that's not the truth. It's very hard to accept that we live in an incredibly unfair society and that we, in many ways, participate in that unfairness and that corruption and that inequality, whether we know it or we don't. And so I think it's very hard to accept psychologically and emotionally, both like how heartbreaking the reality is and at the same time not to feel scared for what that means for us, what that means for people who have had a like this family legacy of businesses, of companies, of education, even like a skin color, which in Mexico does make a difference, unfortunately. No, it's like a sad thing to say, but it's something that I just remember as a young girl being like, what's up with this? Do you seriously don't see it? So I think it's the threat of what that means for the higher classes because to be honest, since in Mexico it happens that you're born into a certain status, you're born into a certain, and then you have all these people at the bottom working like crazy and actually deserving a lot of that richness of those resources. So I think it's hard to accept emotionally. I think it's threatening. And I also think that people are very educated by social media nowadays. And so a lot of the people know what they know through Facebook, through Instagram. And I worked at a marketing agency, so I know how easy it is to get some money, a good headline, and boom, get a specific group of people to believe one idea. And I
Yeah.
don't think people know
Your
that.
question, Pat, I hope she answered your question. We don't have that much time to give the full, we have another speaker and we have a video. And I'm very pleased that Regina has given us so much of her personal life and also understands her society and her peers. So we're moving right along. I'm happy to introduce now uh, Lenny Villagomez Reeves, Dr. Lenny Villagomez Reeves, who is a former United Farm Workers volunteer who attended UC Berkeley and UCSF. She worked at Valley Children's Hospital in Madeira in pediatric emergency medicine, and she's active at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where she co-chairs its National Cuba and Bolivarian Alliance Committee, and has been with the Pastors for Peace, the Friendship Caravan to Cuba, and Saving Lives campaign.
Hi.
She will elaborate further on herself.
Yeah, I'm Lenny Villagomez Reeves, and I'm a mixed ethnicity person from Central California. Mexico is definitely part of that mix, so I speak Spanish ever since I was a kid. And also, when I was a teenager, I used to get sent during school vacations to Mexico to stay with relatives. I graduated from high school at the same time as the United Farm Workers began the famous grape strike in Delano in 1965, led by Cesar Chavez, among others. And I was involved in that struggle for years. I finally left the Farm Workers Union in 73 to go to college, which incidentally was the only reason you could ever leave the union that didn't get Cesar mad at you. But what this is about is the amazing transformation of Mexico. Mexico has historically had a very strong, consistent foreign policy, but with internal policies that were at sometimes worthy of the progressive, principled country that Mexico has repeatedly struggled to become, but often reflected betrayal, corruption, and a constant struggle against neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and the kind of bourgeois people that we have been hearing about, and which I have to confess my family in Mexico, my relatives in Mexico are also that kind of people. This is about the fourth transformation. And the fourth transformation is resources first to the poor for the good of all. A new epic in Mexico centering the rural, the urban poor, workers, economic, indigenous, and Afro-Mexicano populations in political, economic, community infrastructure, and most important, in the concept of the country. It's the fourth transformation. Why fourth? Well, first transformation was Mexico fought for independence from 1810 to 1821, threw off the colonial chains. Second, the Reforma, with Don Benito Juarez, a Zapoteca First Nations president, who led the separation of church and state and led the resistance to the French invasion that attempted to reconquer Mexico and reduce it again to a colony. For those of you who already don't know this, Cinco de Mayo represents the commemoration of the Battle of Puebla in that struggle when Mexican patriots, mostly indigenous, beat the you-know-what out of the French forces, who were then thought to be the finest army in the world. It was a remarkable victory. The third transformation was the Mexican Revolution, and it was the first great revolution of the 20th century. And I'll soon mention some of the advances achieved by the Mexican Revolution. But each of these first three transformations were violent until the nonviolent fourth transformation, which is this one, which is equally profound. It's economic and political power, each in its place, and the government at the service of the people. They're calling it Mexican humanism, and it has two fundamental bases. One is the pueblos originarios, the First Nations people, the indigenous people, the great civilizations, right? who originally built what is now Mexico. And the second is the transformations and the great heroes and heroines who have made Mexico what it is. And they were profound and essential to the nation. But none of the previous transformations recognized the importance of indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples with rights to land, water, public resources, and the right to use these as they see fit. And that's arrived with the fourth transformation. Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo is the current president of Mexico. And let me quote her. She said, "As a woman president, something we didn't think we would see in Mexico, I didn't arrive alone at the presidency, but accompanied by all the women of the country." Why didn't we think we'd see that? Because, for one thing, women didn't get the vote in Mexico until 1953, which is in my lifetime, right? 53. Women played a huge role in the Mexican Revolution, both as support personnel and directly as soldaderas. Lázaro Cárdenas, the president who extended the revolutionary period into what's now called the Third Transformation, accomplished many amazing things. He was a leader in the armed struggle of the revolution. His first act as president was to cut his salary in half. He accomplished land reform, educational reform with secular education, empowerment of industrial workers and union labor with housing and health services established as workers' rights, establishment of a national health system, subsidy for staples for the poor, the nationalization of the railroads and of the petroleum industry. This has been very important. He did establish a cabinet-level Department of Indigenous Affairs and with the intention of defending indigenous communities from persecution and abuse and recognizing the value of indigenous cultures. Cárdenas ended capital punishment in Mexico. Mexico, under the Cárdenas government, supported the elected government of Republican Spain against the fascist military coup led by Franco, not just in words, but selling arms to the Republican Army, underwriting other arms purchases, supporting the Republic and the League of Nations, giving food, shelter, and education to children orphaned during the Spanish Civil War. And eventually, Mexico received about 40,000 Spanish refugees after the fascists, supported by Hitler and Mussolini, defeated the Spanish Republic, which had been largely abandoned by the rest of the so-called Western world, other than some 35,000 brave volunteers from many countries, including famous Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros. But although Cárdenas supported women's suffrage, he wasn't able to achieve it. A constitutional amendment was passed unanimously in 1937, was sent to the states for ratification. But through various sorts of political trickery, somehow ratification failed. So only 71 years after universal women's suffrage in Mexico began, on June 2nd, 2024, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo won a landslide victory as the candidate of the Sigamos Haciendo Historia party. That means we're going to keep making history party. It was a coalition of Morena, the Labor Party, and the Green Party. And her program definitely included commitment to previous President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's fourth transformation policies, including Plan C, a package of 18 constitutional amendments proposed by López Obrador earlier that year, which included increasing the minimum wage above inflation, elevating social programs into constitutional law, and electing judiciary members by popular vote. We're going to hear more about that in a minute. And implementing new social programs for students from preschool to secondary education and for women ages 60 to 64. Claudia Sheinbaum was inaugurated on October 1st, 2024, not that long ago. She's already achieved many of her announced goals, most of her announced goals, and more. And her current approval ratings in polls in Mexico is 82.5%. So yeah, the election of judges. Mexico is the first country in the world to decide to elect judges at all levels. And the first judicial elections were held in May of 2025. And the elected head of the Supreme Court de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos is Hugo Aguilar Ortiz, a Mixteco indigenous lawyer from Oaxaca, who becomes the first indigenous person to hold Mexico's highest judicial office. And he spoke during the election certification ceremony and said, this is a quote, Hugo Aguilar Ortiz, the new head of the Supreme Court of Mexico, and he said, the days when our words, our requests, and even our mere presence were met with ridicule and discrimination in these very institutions are now behind us. Thank you for everything. The history of Mexico cannot be understood without considering the participation of indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples at various moments of transformation. The electoral process we are now completing was no exception. I am confident that this is the beginning of the full inclusion of indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples in the public life of our country. End quote. So, some other achievements. Mexico has recognized Palestine as a state and received the Palestinian ambassador, Nadia Rashid. Former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in June 2023 officially recognized the state of Palestine, elevating the Palestinian mission in Mexico from a special delegation to full embassy status. And in February of 2025, Sheinbaum affirmed that Mexico recognizes the state of Palestine. Mexico makes a voluntary contribution to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, which of course the US does not do. A huge challenge, speaking of the US, for los Estados Unidos Mexicanos is the quote unquote country without a name, the United States of America, so called because the words United States are used by many other countries, including Mexico, both currently and historically. And America, hey, it's two continents and a connecting land bridge. We don't own that name, huh? And the US has invaded Mexico multiple times, beginning in 1806. And in 1846 to 48, almost half of Mexico was seized by the US when President James Polk deployed forces across the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. And although us US people have been indoctrinated through popular culture with Remember the Alamo versions of this war and the teaching of a really distorted history in our schools that portrays this as a somehow righteous attempt by Texas to become first independent and then part of the US. In fact, the so-called Mexican-American War was motivated by pro-slavery forces, and this was widely recognized at that time. Because Mexico, again, as we said, won independence from Spain in 1821 after a lengthy rebellion and began passing measures against slavery, finally outlawing it in 1829 by decree of then President Vicente Guerrero, who may himself have had some African ancestry. And so then there was enormous Southern slaveholder US migration into the Mexican state of Texas, and that was the instigation for the quote unquote independence movement. A couple of contemporary opinions about that war. Ulysses Grant was then just a soldier in the ranks, and he said, I don't think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. And then he also said the Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. This is what Frederick Douglass said about the US war against Mexico. He called it a slaveholding crusade and spoke and wrote a denunciation of the Mexican War as a murderous war, a war against the free states, a war against freedom, against the Negro, and against the interests of the working men of this country, and as a means of extending that great evil and damning curse, Negro slavery. Abraham Lincoln, as a freshman congressman, accused Polk of illegitimately escalating a conflict over disputed territory, for the sole purpose of extending slave territory. We didn't learn any of this in school, did we? Oh. Thomas Lord, a minister at the time, was equally clear. It's the evil genius of slavery that's led us into war with Mexico. Why was Texas annexed to this union? The interests of slavery demand it. And what has the annexation of Texas to do with our war with Mexico? It was the fatal step that led to this war. The U.S. Army occupied Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, from September 1847 to June 1848. In this century, in 1914, the U.S. invaded and occupied the port city of Veracruz, which, for those of you not familiar with the geography, is on the Caribbean coast, nowhere near the U.S. border. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson sent General Pershing across the U.S.-Mexico border to seek and destroy Francisco Pancho Villa. This invasion was a resounding failure, which was ended by U.S. entry into World War I. Shortly after the current Trump regime took power in the U.S., the ideas of an invasion of Mexico or a bombing campaign, or both, began to circulate. And given the history, of the U.S. interaction with Mexico, this is not such an impossible idea. He declared drug labs and drug cartels foreign terrorist organizations. Plans for airstrikes and special forces raids were publicized. There was a big increase in surveillance flights, U.S. military surveillance flights along the U.S.-Mexico border, and Republican congressmen introduced legislation authorizing the use of military force against Mexico. And by March of this year, mainstream news reports like the Associated Press were reading things like Dateline Washington. The Pentagon is sending nearly 3,000 additional active duty troops to the US-Mexico border as President Donald Trump seeks to blah, 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 blah. Pete Hegseth has ordered elements of a Stryker Brigade combat team and a general support aviation battalion. Fort Carson is sending 2,400 soldiers from the 2nd Stryker Brigade, et cetera, et cetera. Third Combat Aviation Brigade will also be deployed. Already about 9,200 U.S. troops in total are at the southern border. Obviously, I've abbreviated that report, but every word I've said is part of that news report. But Sheinbaum said that while Mexico is committed to working with the United States to stop the flow of fentanyl, Mexico will not tolerate any American interference. And she faced him down. This is a quote. I told him, no, President Trump, our territory is inviolable. Our sovereignty is inviolable. And she added that while the two countries can collaborate, we will never accept the presence of the U.S. Army in our territory. And she sent a proposed constitutional amendment to the Mexican Congress that explicitly says that the Mexican people reject foreign interventions. Another quote, the people of Mexico will under no circumstance accept foreign interventions like coups d'etats or interferences in our elections or the violation of Mexican territory, be it by land, sea, or air, close quote. And the invasion of Mexico planned by Trump did not occur. I leave you to make the connection between U.S. invasion of Mexico and the interests of slavery in the 19th century and U.S. invasion of Mexico in the interests of present-day U.S. fascism. And just parenthetically, even though the U.S. acts like, the government is very worried about Mexican drug cartels, they're very happy to allow the flow of U.S. manufactured arms to those cartels in Mexico. There was a case just dismissed by the Supreme Court of the United States. It was Smith & Wesson Brands Incorporated versus Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos. And in this suit, the government of Mexico sued 7 US gun manufacturers, alleging that the companies aided and abetted unlawful gun sales that routed firearms to Mexican drug cartels, supplied firearms to dealers who they know illegally sell to Mexican gun traffickers. They make design and marketing decisions intended to make these attractive to gang members, advertising them focused on names like military grade and calling, armament el super jefe. The US Supreme Court dismissed the suit earlier this month because, after all, military style assault weapons are widely legal and purchased by ordinary consumers. That's a quote from their opinion. And the fact that they don't make non-defaceable serial numbers and that they call the guns El Super Jefe or have graphics alluding to Mexican history. This is not in any way, I guess, considered extraordinary by the US Supreme Court. But basically, the suit was dismissed because in 2005, the US Congress passed a law granting gun manufacturers essentially total impunity. It's called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. So other challenges besides direct invasion and flooding Mexico with armaments are attempts by the US to dictate policies as well as to install or overthrow governments in all countries of the Americas. Ellen, did you want to say something? You're muted. You're still muted.
Yep, you just got to unmute yourself, Ellen.
Well, I'll go on while you do that. So an obvious recent attempt was, when Mexico was making the decision to elect judges at all levels, the US ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar, just stepped way out of the bounds of appropriate diplomatic conduct and said, the direct election of judges represents a risk for the functioning of Mexico's democracy and the integration of the Mexican, American, and Canadian economies. And then President Lopez Obrador sent a note of protest saying that it was unfortunate, imprudent, a meddlesome declaration, demonstrated a lack of respect, an unacceptable act of interference, and a violation of Mexican sovereignty. We don't accept any representative of foreign governments intervening in matters that are solely up to us to resolve, he said. Ellen,
I just wanted to pick up on your and have a couple of minutes for people to ask questions, because we're still online in process to have the Hugo Ortiz video to come next, Brian.
Hugo Aguilar Ortiz is, as was mentioned earlier, the new head of the Supreme Court of Mexico. I tell you what, I only have a little more to go. Let me run through it real quick.
9:15, and I know people will be asking you some questions now. And then we wanted to have a full question and answer, but we only go till 9:30. And so I think if you want to throw it out as a possibility, what we have in the chat, Lenny and everyone, is we have a whole list of different media in Mexico where you can follow up some of these concepts and historical points that Lenny has talked about and that Regina has talked about. And these are alternative media. The urgency of this video and the reason that I planned it with the Latin American Caribbean Working Group is that there's not enough information. That's why I'm so thrilled that Regina and Lenny have put this together for us. But you don't have a lot of this alternative media, which you can easily watch on YouTube, which has, most of them have subtitles. So you can really figure out what's going on, as you see in the chat, all these different ones and many, many more from the ones I have. And I've also given you a One is the weapons campaign that we were hoping to use. I don't think I have that written by it, but it says it's by the U.S. Embassy Administration ongoing efforts to stem firearms. That's in the link, if you can see that, under Rompaviendo TV. So
Well,
that's
again, the U.S. Supreme Court has thrown out that suit, and any efforts that Mexico makes to not permit a huge flood of arms into their country, they're going to have to make unilaterally. So yeah,
so that's actually an ongoing campaign. That's one of the few that's actually working. But
yeah.
with
Well,
the
again, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided that the U.S. is not going to, assume any responsibility for stopping the flow of arms into Mexico.
okay, well, that's new for me. I had no
Yeah,
idea.
that was June 3rd.
Oh my
The
goodness.
Supreme
Okay,
Court
so that's
decision.
brand new. So
Yeah.
that is not a cooperative thing. So I'm behind the times there.
Well, I'm sure that there are people who are cooperating. Just real quick, I do want to mention that both AMLO and Claudia are tremendous communicators, and they hold very frequent, not just press conferences, but kind of like talks with the people. And especially if you speak Spanish, that's even better. But if you don't, you can get the subtitles.
Well,
There
thank
is
you, because that's all in the chat. I hope
That's
people will
great.
copy that. There are
Okay,
plenty
so
more.
I'm gonna cut it real short, but there are some things that need to be said just real quick in the next, 30 to 60 seconds. I'm even going to skip the part that I thought I was being brought here to talk about, which is Mexico-Cuba relations, and I'm going to go straight to the issues having to do with migration, because this is so timely. And as a Chicana, I really can't drop this. Okay. So she addressed the issue this was at CELAC. She said, first of all, she said, we reject, as Mexico has historically done, trade sanctions and blockades. No to the blockade of Cuba, no to the blockade of Venezuela. But she also addressed the issue of migration and the need to cooperate in addressing human mobility, as she said, from a humanistic perspective, and said, our historical position has been that the most humane and most successful way to address the structural causes of inequality, unemployment, and violence that drive migration. We reject racism, classism, the violation of human rights, and the criminalization of our brothers and sisters on the continent who, for whatever reason, have had to migrate north. After the ICE raids, the repression and the kidnappings in the Los Angeles region, and the popular protests against abuses of and attacks on people of Mexican ancestry, Sheinbaum firmly voiced Mexico's concerns about the treatment of migrants. And she said, the Mexican government reiterates its unwavering commitment to the protection and defense of the human rights of Mexicans living overseas, regardless of their immigration status. In this sense, we make a respectful but firm call to United States authorities for all immigration procedures to be carried out with adherence to due process within a framework of respect for human dignity and the rule of law.
Very good.
Sheinbaum also stressed that Mexico would continue to pursue diplomatic efforts on behalf of its citizens. The Mexican government will continue using all diplomatic and legal channels available to express its disagreement with practices that criminalize immigration and put at risk the safety and well-being of our communities in the United States. And I open it to questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Lenny. We're going to open it to questions now. And I really want to encourage people to follow this up. You know, we're very, very late in the process of discovering anything about Mexico. So tonight we're really cramming it in. But it's really up to people who are participating tonight in the MAPA webinar to bring these issues to their groups because it hasn't been done. I've been alone in this for 5 years, and I really am hopeful that this webinar that was and that the articles, the 5 articles that MAPA has in its newsletters on this from me will be read. And now we have this recording, and you have Regina and Lenny's presentation. Lenny has given us a great deal more detail and emphasis on the entire historical perspective. So let's please, let's ask some questions, and then if we have time, we will do the Hugo Ortiz Supreme Court new chief leader. He won by a landslide, the Mestica leader. So let's do that. Please ask questions to Lenny, and raise your hand in the chat or in the react button, please.
Yeah, and for anyone having trouble getting to that reaction, you can just type in the chat as well that you have a question, and I'll be happy to bring it right up. While people are getting their questions together, can you talk a little bit more? Because I've heard, Lenny, about these daily briefings that take place, and I hear that they go on for well over an hour. Do they happen every day?
They do. They do. They do. That's
Yeah,
sometimes
it just seems so
2 hours
strange compared to what we have here in the United States. Um, could you
every
talk a little
day.
bit more about that? Seems very, very different and interesting.
Victoria's got her hand
Oh,
raised.
yeah. Yep. Let me bring her up. Victoria, you just have to unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question. There you
Hi,
are.
Lenny, and it was nice to hear from you, Regina. I have a question about the election, about the judicial elections. The turnout was very low, which seems concerning. And so, what else can you say about that?
I don't know why the turnout was low. It may just be because it's a new idea. It's possible that Regina would know much more about that.
Well, yeah, I agree with that, Lenny. I think it was a very new idea. Most people didn't know who to vote for as well. That's something that I heard of a lot. They weren't really sure who the candidates were and how that was going to work. I also know that, like we said before, it was also very controversial. And for a long time, there were even marches and protests and a lot of information about this new judicial system as a threat to the democracy of the country. You know, a lot of the black media saying that this was a danger, that how was it possible that the people voting for the judges. So I think there was a lot of fear going around, circulating around. And the fact that, yeah, there wasn't a lot of knowledge around the candidates and who to vote for.
Well, the 13% voting public, the 13% was considered by Claudia and the government a good turnout. In terms of the 6 ballots, they had to vote for thousands, several thousand people on the candidate. Well, they broke it down to 6 ballots full of. There was a process by which they were eliminated. They were selected slowly, but the 6 ballots had to be trained, meaning educated as to how to use those ballots and do it. And I agree that it was the first time, Lenny, that this had happened, but that Claudia felt it was a very good turnout. Many of the Morena party thought it was a good turnout. So we'll see. And so the Chamber of Deputies was elected, the Senate was elected, and other parts of the government were elected. The judges, the magistrates, and the anyway, the many elected officials by, as you said, Lenny, this was the first time in history. And it may be the first time that this has happened anywhere. But the Mexicans are very, very proud of the judicial reform. And these reforms have gone into the Constitution, especially the indigenous one, whereby now, for the first time in history, the many indigenous peoples of Mexico are part of the government. They are under the laws of the government, which means for the first time they receive all the benefits that other Mexicans have. So this is an enormous historical event for them, and they're covered. And wherever Claudia goes in her mañaneras, her morning press conferences, or her visits constantly to every corner of the country, she mentions that the indigenous is now a part of, they're covered now and protected by the government of Mexico and the Constitution.
Gallardo has had a question for a while. He keeps,
Pardon?
Mr. Gallardo, Juan Gallardo, has been trying to ask a question for quite a while.
Oh, okay. Please go ahead.
Unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah, you just gotta unmute yourself, Juan.
Yes. Juan is part of our committee with the
I see.
working.
Okay. Hit that unmute button. You're not unmuted yet.
Yep, a little blue box should pop up for you. But if you can't manage, of course, you can ask it through the chat. We'd be happy to read it out. Oh, there you are. There you are.
Okay. My question is regarding the health system in Mexico. I'm here so in general, I'm interested on that to see what the government is doing regarding the health system. But I want to mention one thing. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I know a large number of people that go to Mexico to have work on their teeth. They're going to Mexico to have their eyes examination and do some surgery there also. So I'm just trying to stress that there are a number of part of the population in the Southwest that find the health system in Mexico absolutely necessary for them. And but what I'm more my real question is, what is the health system down in the southern part of Mexico?
Could you answer that?
Puebla, Oaxaca, for instance.
Are you familiar with the health system?
Sorry, I didn't notice I was muted. Not really. I wouldn't be updated in terms of that. I mean, I know that the health system here also has a lot of challenges. People do come to get a lot of work done, but it's through like the private medical providers. And so I know that the health system has a lot of challenges, but I wouldn't really know right now how that's changing. I'm sorry. I wish I did.
I know only a little bit about it, which is that, during the long period of the neoliberal years, which started in the 50s and went until AMLO's election, there were a lot of barriers for people to become doctors or to become especially specialists of various kinds. And in fact, that is why Mexico has had to contract the Cuban doctors, you know. Now, starting in about 2018, with AMLO, that's begun to change, but you can't train doctors in a second, especially specialists. So I think the East is going to become more and more robust and more staffed, And in fact, Mexican Americans can, as independent workers, by paying into the system, become eligible for the Mexican health system, and for other benefits. So that's something that people can look into if they are, fall into that category.
As of just,
Don't fall for any scammers, because there's some terrible scammers out there trying to get people to sign up for things that aren't real.
now the Mexicans that live in America, live in the United States,
We
are
all live in America, mi vida.
they're able to get full protections now, and if they come to Mexico, they're given even given sometimes housing, but they're given a basic health care, and they're given a Social Security. It's amazing. This just happened this past week. It's very exciting. And from what I know from following Claudia as she goes from different towns, very often it's inauguration of a big hospital in one of the larger towns. And the training of medical doctors. I haven't paid a close attention of it to bring it down to detailed data, but it's happening, what you just said, Lenny. It's really exploding. And let's just hope it continues.
Thank you.
In the meantime, don't believe in the hype. If Marco Rubio says it and Pompeo says it, it's a lie. You know that the Cuban medical workers are not being human trafficked. Even though I didn't get to give that part of the presentation, I have to mention those facts because they are facts.
And another fact along those lines, with the wonderful Cuban rural workers that are still persisting, even with the kind of pressure they're getting, is that Mexico is one of the best friends of Cuba. You went into it just a little bit, but Mexico is giving Cuba enormous amount of fuel, and
Selling.
it was donating, but now it's selling. At the beginning, it was giving it. But if it's selling it to Cuba at a low price, all the better. But they're finding, especially in the pharmaceutical area, they are planning very big partnerships in pharmaceutical work together, with the health center. This is really an exploding area, is the health center, with pharmaceuticals, development of medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and centers, with Cuba maybe training some of them in Mexico itself. There's a lot of breaking the barriers of the sanctions with Cuba, and Mexico is a big asset in that.
Mexico was one of the countries that always resisted US pressure to break relations with Cuba or to come after them in the OAS. It's again, Mexico has historically had a wonderful foreign policy, always. It's domestic policy that needed work, and it's getting the work it needs, and couldn't be happier about that. And as long as I've been quoting Claudia all this time, I'm going to quote her about the special cynicism that it's, the US has been threatening countries that invite Cuban doctors and nurses. That's a politicization of the struggle to eliminate human trafficking to go after Cuba. And it's pretty disgusting. And Claudia is real clear on the issue. She says, first, it's not forced labor. The presence of more than 3,000 Cuban doctors in Mexico is part of a government and international cooperation agreement. Their positions, salaries, and Social Security in Cuba are guaranteed, while their living, working, and subsistence conditions in Mexico are protected. We're grateful to the Cuban doctors, and it's important that people know they're not hired in the place of Mexican doctors. Contracts for Cuban doctors are made in place of specialties where there are no Mexican doctors that want to be there. And she said, we reject, as Mexico has historically done, trade sanctions and blockades. No to the blockade of Cuba, no to the blockade of Venezuela. And that's where I'm going to end.
Well said.
Said. I want to leave it with you that one of the big controversies with the very left in Mexico is how can she do both? How can she bring in enormous amount of foreign investment in some of the big multinationals, which she is encouraging and bringing in everything from Walmart to automakers. And we didn't talk too much about the kind of general international investment that's going on. And at the same time, the poor first. And in other words, can she have her cake and eat it too? That it comes down to that. And that's something for another discussion, another webinar. I hope people can continue to follow, but that the interesting part of is what you talked about in regards to Cuba. So I wanted to say, if you want a book, the books on Amazon for Mexico, there is one in Spanish that I have, and the others I did not care for whatsoever. They were pretty superficial. But the one, if you want to read it in Spanish, is called Presidenta, and it has a big picture of Claudia on front. So besides these alternative media sites, I hope everyone will continue to follow their interests. There's so many aspects to this. And I don't know if Lenny or you or Regina want to put your emails in the chat in case people want to get in touch with you, maybe to talk again to their group. I think that might be useful. If you want to do that, if you feel like you want to go on some kind of speaker platform. I want to say how glad I am that Lenny and I have been working in the Bolivarian Alliance group with some of the others that are here, and that is we support the Cuba effort to get rid of the blockade and the sanctions.
Thank you both for being with us. Really appreciate your time and learning a little bit more about Mexico, and more to come. Oh, and don't worry, we will be sharing in a follow-up email the link to this recording, but also all of the resources that were shared in the chat. So you don't have to scramble and get them now. We'll send them right to you. Thanks for spending your time with us. Thank you, our wonderful speakers, and our audience, as always.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having us tonight.
Have a fantastic night.
You too.